Chapter 7 of A Lucky Deal by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, in which Jack restores the oblong yellow envelope and its contents to its owner. Of course, Jack had a budget of interesting news to tell his mother and sister at the supper table that night.
"Oh, Jack, how could you do it?"
exclaimed Annie when he described how he grabbed the loaded revolver just as Oliver Bird fired it.
"Well, sis, I never stopped to consider why I did it. The whole thing was over in a moment. And you actually saved the man's life."
"Mr. Bird is sure of it, and that's the way the evening papers put it, so—"
"What? It's printed in the paper? Let me see,"
cried his sister excitedly. Jack pointed out the article to her, and she began to read it with a great deal of interest.
"But that isn't all that happened to me," grinned the lad with his mouth full of Irish stew. "I should think that was enough for one day, John," said his mother, smiling. "I found an envelope with a wad of money in it." "Jack Hazard, you don't mean it!"
cried Annie, dropping the paper at this startling bit of intelligence.
"I don't usually say what I don't mean, sis. You really and truly did find some money? How much?"
"You promise you won't faint?"
"What nonsense!"
"Mr. Bishop and I both counted it. It amounted to $6,700. Mother and daughter both held up their hands in amazement.
"Why, that's a fortune!"
"It would be to us, but probably the man who lost it considers such an amount a mere bagatelle."
"Did you find the owner?"
"No, there was nothing in the envelope to identify the person to whom the money belonged. Mr. Bishop says we may expect to see it advertised for, probably tomorrow morning."
"Surely you'll get something for returning the money,"
said his sister. "I shall be satisfied if I get $15 so Mother can pay the agent Friday."
"You ought to get a great deal more than that. A good many people would keep that money, had they found it the way you did. You ought to get at least $100.
"Well, if I'm offered $100, I shan't refuse it, sis. You and Mother need a new dress each, and I should like to get them for you."
"It's very like you, Jack, to think of us first, but we'll talk about all that when we see what you do realize out of your find."
"All right," said Jack, helping himself to another hot biscuit.
"The whole neighborhood is talking about you, Jack," said his sister. "More than a dozen people whom we never saw before were here today, talking to Mother and saying ever so many flattering things about you. Now, when they read tonight's paper, I'm afraid we shall have another crowd tomorrow. Why, you'll be considered a regular hero."
"I'd like it better if they wouldn't interest themselves so much with our affairs, sis," said Jack in a tone of annoyance. "They wouldn't make themselves so prominent if we were dispossessed because we couldn't pay our rent."
"I'm afraid we'll have to submit with the best grace we can. It is one of the penalties of newspaper notoriety."
After supper, Jack started to walk uptown to number 72 East 62nd Street, as he didn't feel that he could afford car fare. He reached Mr. Bird's residence, a 4-story brownstone front, a little after 8 o'clock. He was very kindly received by the broker and his family, who regarded him as the savior of the household. He spent a very pleasant hour, and when he insisted that it was time for him to go, Mrs. Bird stepped up and presented him with a very handsome little gold watch and chain as a small token of their gratitude and esteem. Jack was very much surprised, not expecting anything of the kind, and for the first time in his life he was at a loss how to suitably express himself. The very first thing Jack did next morning when he reached the office was to look over the Lost and Found column in the Herald, but he failed to find anything having reference to the money he had found.
"Hello,"
exclaimed Frank Simpson, who sat beside him reading the World.
"Say, this is pretty tough."
"What's tough?" asked Jack without looking up.
"Why, here's a story about a woman who lost a big wad of money yesterday." "What's that?"
asked Jack with a sudden interest.
"She and her husband have been saving up and pinching themselves for the last 20 years to save enough money to buy a house where they could spend their old age in security and comfort. They did buy a house, but the city took it on valuation because it stood in the way of a new bridge, and they received $6,700. They left this money with the Blank Trust Company on Wall Street. After looking around some time, they bought another house, and yesterday the woman drew the money from the trust company to pay for it, and for the new furniture and other things they wanted. But when she got home, she found she had lost the envelope containing the money somewhere on the street. But just where, she has no idea. She's about crazy over the loss. Gee whiz, if that isn't hard luck, I don't know what is," concluded young Simpson emphatically. "Where does she live?" asked Jack in a tone of great excitement. "It's down here somewhere," answered Frank, looking over the article. Here it is. Number 200 Prescott Street, Bronx. Let me have the paper, cried Jack, grabbing it eagerly. He glanced over the article with feverish interest, then rushed into Mr. Bishop's office and pointed it out to that gentleman. I guess there's no doubt but this woman is the person who lost the very money that you picked up yesterday. The amount, as well as other particulars, corresponds. Go around to the Blank Trust Company and have them describe the woman and the notes they paid her. The cashier will probably have a memorandum of the banks that issued the large notes at any rate. If the list corresponds with those in the envelope in the safe, you had better take the package up to the address given in the World, and if the woman can describe the money with reasonable accuracy and her description coincides with that furnished by the trust company, you'll be pretty safe in restoring to her the sum she lost. I'm very glad, for the poor woman's sake, that you were the one who found her money." Jack followed the manager's suggestions, and the result was they were both satisfied they had located the rightful owner of the $6,700. "Start right up there now, Jack, and get back as soon as you can," said Mr. Bishop. "The cashier will hand you the car fare." It was something over an hour before Jack reached the address printed by the World, a small 2-story frame building, one of a row of 6, on a side street off Westchester Avenue. He rang the bell, and a boy answered, holding the door partly ajar. "I should like to see Mrs. Breeze," said Jack in a businesslike way. "Are you a reporter?" asked the boy doubtfully. "Well, hardly," grinned the young messenger. "I'm from Wall Street." "Who are you talking to, Bobby?" asked a woman's voice rather petulantly. "There's a boy here from Wall Street who says he wants to see you," answered the young hopeful. "What does he want?" "What do you want?" repeated the lad. "I want to see Mrs. Breeze in reference to the money she lost." "Then let him come in." And Jack was admitted. A sad-faced woman of 50, with her eyes swollen from weeping, made her appearance from the back room. "Has any trace been found of my money?" asked the woman with suppressed eagerness. "If you'll describe the notes as well as you can remember them, I will be able to answer you," said Jack, who saw that Mrs. Breeze's personal description exactly corresponded with that furnished by the trust company. "The 6 $1,000 bills were new, but I didn't notice the name of the bank either on them or on the other notes, one of which was a $500 and the other 2 $100. I had them in a large oblong envelope. That is all I can say about them." "I think you've described them correctly," said Jack, producing the envelope he had picked up. "Is this your property?" The woman pounced on the envelope like a hawk, opened the flap, took out the money, and counted it with eager eyes. Then, satisfied that it was all there, restored to her in the most wonderful manner after she had given it up for loss, she sank back down in her chair and began to cry convulsively. After a moment or two she recovered her composure and inquired of Jack how the money had been found. He told her how he had picked it up close to the entrance of the trust company. She had drawn the money at 2 o'clock, and Jack had found it close on to 4. It seemed incredible that an envelope containing such a large sum of money could have laid on the sidewalk of a prominent thoroughfare like Wall Street, glanced at and walked over by so many people, and yet no one had the curiosity to pick it up. "What is your name?" asked Mrs. Breeze. "Jack Hazard, ma'am." "You are an honest boy. I am sure you have a good mother, and that she is very proud of you. This money you've returned to me is the savings of our entire life. I don't like to think what the result might have been if it had been lost for good and all. As testimony of our gratitude, I would like you to accept these 2 bills, and she offered Jack the 2 $100 notes. "No, ma'am," said the boy. "I couldn't think of taking so much money from you. But you must, or you will take away half the pleasure I feel at the recovery of my money. Really, it is a great deal less than you really deserve. I insist that you accept them," said Mrs. Breeze firmly, forcing the bills into his hand. Jack saw she was intensely earnest in her demand, and with some reluctance he put them in his pocket. "I'm very happy indeed that you have got your money back," he said as he rose to go. "I feel like another woman to what I did before you came here. Be sure I shall not soon forget the honest lad to whom I am indebted for its recovery," were her last words as Jack ran down the steps after bidding her good-bye. End of chapter 7.